Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate you joining from wherever in the world you're joining from. Today, we're going to be doing a session on how to create incredible story maps, in our opinion. We're going to be looking at the good, the bad, and the darn right ugly. And what we're hoping for is that this session will give you some practical value that you can take away and integrate back into your story mapping processes. The very last piece of advice that we're going to cover is probably the most important, and it's also something that, from what we've seen, generally people aren't even aware is actually possible. So do stick around for that. We've also got some trial licenses to the tools if you're interested. So again, stick around to the end for that. So let's do some quick intros. I'm James, co-founder and CEO of Avion. I've been in product engineering and design for well over a decade. And as my role as CEO of a product company, I get to speak to many product teams and product leaders from varying sizes and scales of company. And what's great is I get to ask them and hear about their planning and delivery processes and what they find hard. And of course, I get to ask them about their story mapping process, and I get to see it firsthand and interrogate that. So I'm hoping to bring some of that to the table here today, and hopefully you'll be able to pick up some insight and some value from it. So over to you, Lewis.
Thanks, James. Yes, I'm Lewis. I am with James on a lot of those conversations that he has with product leaders, but also I have a history myself of scoping and steering large-scale programs, agile transformations, and more recently now really just looking after our customers at Avion. The rest of my time is networking, looking after our own community, and really speaking to product leaders of all shapes and sizes from different industries. So that's me.
Cool. Okay, so very briefly on the format and how we're going to run today. So we've identified 4 problem areas that we want to cover to try and give you some tips on how to move forward with better story maps. And for each area, what we're going to do is show you and break down a bad example or even a couple of examples that we've actually seen in the wild. We're going to show you these examples in Miro, and we're not having a jab at Miro at all. We're just using that as an environment that hopefully feels familiar to you, which is ultimately a whiteboarding environment, which is where most people are doing their story mapping. We're then going to show you what good really looks like, and we're going to demonstrate that in Avion. Obviously, Avion is our tool, but you can still apply these principles wherever you do your story mapping. And, Avion is built to try and address some of these problems. So it kind of makes sense for us to be showing you in there. But like I say, you can definitely take some of this stuff away regardless of what tool you're actually using. Okay, so let's move on to the first problem area. So first problem area is the backbone. Over to you, Lewis.
Thanks, James. So I think the first thing we're going to do is cover a couple of examples of, as James said, things we've seen in the wild. And we've just used the sort of base Miro template here to give a rough idea of the structure. But if we focus in on the content of the backbone, this is an example that is from one of our customers. It's been anonymized, but you can already see here that the backbone and the way that they've chosen to structure their journeys and steps is incredibly technical. Something much closer to development areas or features than it is journeys, customer journeys and steps. So the first thing I'll say is if you're building out your backbone and it begins to look like this, see that as a red flag, if you like, an early red flag that you haven't quite got in the right mindset. The challenge that they had here and that you have here too is that we're unable to know which customer behaviors or outcomes we're influencing with the work we do. So sure, we'll know that one of these cards or one of these stories will relate to this development area or this feature. But we've actually got lots of different places to capture that relationship already. We can capture that in Jira, we can capture that in additional documentation. The story map is not the place to be capturing those relationships. The purpose of story mapping is being able to deliberately expose the levers we can pull in order to influence new customer behaviors or new outcomes for users. So this is what the backbone is for. And if you're creating a structure that's highly technical or focused on development areas or features instead of experience, you're really just creating an additional layer of hierarchy or documentation on top of Jira. So what that's doing is putting you at risk really of slowing down value delivery to customers. And that's exactly what was happening for this customer and exactly what will happen in your situation as well. If we move on to the next example, this is a similar flavor, but perhaps a rarer one. And I wouldn't even necessarily call this story mapping, but it's a common bastardization of teams that we see who are just desperate for a bit more structure in their backlog. The mistake here is that the teams have described their development process, the journeys that their team will take through the product development lifecycle. And whilst I can appreciate that this, for a team who really lacks structure and their backlogs feel like chaos or they have no handle on the work they're doing, it will add that structure, but it is quite clearly missing the point. Where is the customer? Where is the personas? You end up with this quite pretty, almost waterfall-esque pattern across the screen often. But you're opening yourself up with that to lots of potential bloats and a risk that you're putting too much trust in the existing technical process instead of thinking about how do we actually deliver value in a way that is lean and predictable. Over to you, James.
Cool. So we've talked about what we shouldn't be mapping within the backbone. So how should the backbone really be used? Well, Lewis obviously touched on some of these things, but we should be thinking about the backbone purely in terms of customer experience, user experience. Now, you can see in this example, this is an example based around Airbnb. So we've got find accommodation, book accommodation, list my property, and then we've got the individual steps that users need to take to achieve those goals. Now, this is quite an easy example to imagine because when we think of Airbnb, we think of almost quite a like interactive front-end heavy experience. But this applies no matter what team you are. Even if you're a platform team or an API team, you still have a customer or a user of some sort. That might be a developer, it might be an internal team. You need to peel back the onion skin to really figure out who your end user is. And that is who you're building for. That's the experience we're mapping here. So that's the first thing you need to figure out. Who is your end customer and how can we map out their experience to be building in the context of that? The second thing to realize is that people often want a perfectly sequential user journey. And occasionally that happens with things like, an onboarding process or something where you take the user through, exactly what you intend to. But the vast majority of the time, users attack things in very different ways, in very different orders. And what we're trying to do is just make some sense of that order. And that's okay. We can kind of just take the average or even the expected route, and then we can edit that over time. So don't get too hung up on mapping the exact order of things. We're just trying to map, the ideal experience that we're trying to put users through. So another thing that really should go hand in hand with this backbone are your personas. And you can see, in Avion, we've actually got, a feature that ties personas to the backbone. So you define your personas, first of all, here, which I'm sure you've already got in your organization. And then you actually assign those personas here to the journeys or to the steps. So you've always got, the customer types, hand in hand when you're having those conversations around the backbone, the experience and the journeys. The great thing about actually mapping this all out is that it allows you to walk through the journey when you're planning stuff and identify what's actually important to the customer. What are their pain points? what opportunities can you find as a team or as a business to improve that experience? And also, when you are planning stuff, what have we missed? What holes are there in what we're planning on building? So, in order to give you just a really quick checklist of how to kind of verify that what you've done, sort of ticks these boxes for what a backbone should be. First question you want to ask yourself, is it enduring? And what that means is it a part of your product or your experience that is always going to need to be worked on? If we think of finding accommodation for Airbnb, that will never be completed. They will never just tick that off and say, we don't need to do anything more on that. It's part of the experience. It's part of something they will always need to improve, both to improve themselves in the market and also just to retain customers. So is it enduring is the first thing. The second thing is it written from the perspective of your users or customers? And you can see here, nice, easy way to do it is think of a verb to begin with and lead with a verb. But we're not doing it based on internal stuff. We're doing it based on the customer, the user. And then the final thing is just making sure that you're mapping at the same level. And you can map experiences and a backbone at quite different levels. You could go quite high up and think of the real true customer experience, and that can be legitimate in a story map. You could go maybe a level down and map more of a kind of a user journey throughout a product, or you could actually go a level further down from that and map just a pure product experience. All of them are valid and legitimate, but it's when you mix them up that this becomes less valuable. So that's the backbone. Let's move on to problem area number 2, which is releases and slices. Over to you, Lewis.
Thanks, James. Yeah, we'll start with this one. I actually know this is your least favourite or most favourite, James, whichever way you want to talk about it. But if I just let that settle. So sprints, and it's using releases or slices in the story map as sprints. And I'll start by saying that story mapping should be agnostic, of any kind of framework like Scrum, and it needs to be treated as such as well. I see this a lot as well, and I can have some sympathy with why teams default to this. But the problem is, at the end of each sprint, you've not necessarily delivered any actual value to the customer or the experience, and even less likely the business. So, there's no milestone here. There's no lever that we can pull to prioritize a new holistic end-to-end increment of value for the customer. And sprints are not tied to outcomes. So, it's unlikely that if you're working like this, you'll be having a conversation about pushing sprint 2 out 4 months because our assumptions have changed or there's a more immediate need from a customer. And those are the types of prioritization discussions you should be having and need to be having in the story map. So this is a problem. If we go on to the next example, James, and this is similar, but maybe a level removed. So this is when we don't use slices or releases at all in the story map. I will caveat this by saying it does depend to some degree the level at which, or the granularity at which you're story mapping, but typically a single story is really going to be unlikely to deliver a completely new experience or achieve an outcome for a customer, right? And probably even less so the business. So, I remember sort of this time last year, I was speaking to a customer who was working this way. And he said, Lewis, we've prioritized the story map. We're doing all of the most valuable things, but we don't seem to be getting the results out of the other end. And we took a look at it. We took a look at what they were doing, and this is very close to what their map looked like. And the reason they weren't getting the value out of the other end is because although they thought they were delivering, what customers had asked for or what they felt was the most valuable, there was never a complete or a completed narrative, an end-to-end experience that was delivered for a customer that would enable them to achieve a new outcome, right? And that outcome has to be meaningful and strong enough to move a needle for the business as well. So just cherry picking, what we think we want to work on or what's most valuable without having, a real milestone that we can put together of an end-to-end new experience is a problem, right? That there needs to be much more depth to your product strategy than just ordering low-level tasks. And I think James is going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Lewis. So as Lewis said, releases are not sprints, but we still need to have releases. So he touched a little bit on this, but what we really want to be thinking about when we're planning these horizontal slices is user value and product outcomes, right? So if I just click on one of them just to try and sort of give you an example. So this is ratings and reviews. And I've got a tiny little framework here for how you go about this. You name and you frame. So we've got ratings and reviews at Airbnb. The idea is, does everyone understand what ratings and reviews means? Yes, probably. It means that we want to give our users the ability to read and write reviews on Airbnb. We then frame it, and we frame it in the light of, what are we trying to give the user, and what product outcomes and ultimately business outcomes are we trying to affect? So we've got, by showing users star ratings and real user reviews on properties, we expect bookings for the best properties to increase and vice versa. We also want to appear more credible on Google, which star ratings will help with on search engine results pages. So we've framed it not in terms of anything technical, not in terms of anything delivery related like sprints, but we framed it in terms of why we're attacking this piece of work. You can go one step further and actually tag the OKRs that this affects. So if your business is using OKRs, you can tag this against product OKRs. So if we had some OKRs which were drive high-end property bookings up by 5% and increase organic clicks to listings by 20%, you can see how this is really starting to tie together those OKRs, which we've decided as a business our product needs to work on, and this experience which we've planned and mapped out in the story map, and it all starts to effectively come together. Just to note that when we think of value, sometimes the word value is a little bit murky, a little bit difficult. Value can be anything. It could be features or experiences like we've just talked about, but it could be an iteration on an existing experience or feature. It could be a bug fix or a severe production fix. It could be some performance or scalability upgrades, a third-party integration, accessibility improvements, security improvements. All of these things are legitimate to be mapping out as a release, but you just need to be, if you really want to be getting the most value out of these, you need to be thinking in terms of product outcomes, how we affect customer behavior, and how that maps back to what the business is ultimately trying to achieve. So another part of this is dates. And this is a really, dates in anything within product are just like controversial, and it's a bit of a landmine. But I think it's fair to say that a product team should be able to know with some clarity the dates. So for example, they should be able to say, we need to start this work by this time, or we need to finish this work by that time. And in some cases, you're going to know both of those dates, and that's going to give you something to be able to work within. Again, this has nothing to do with sprints. We're not thinking about how we're actually, delivering on a day-to-day basis. We're thinking about the holistic picture. When do we need to be attacking this work? And when you start using dates with releases like this, you get this really nice visualization of a product roadmap. So you can see from top to bottom here, booking experience, ratings and reviews, booking notifications. These are all the valuable things that we need to be working on. And they're all planned in the context of the backbone, because we've got a great backbone. And if you want to take that one step further, you get basically out the box in Avion, you then get a roadmap out of that. So we plot this on a timeline here. So it's just kind of another added advantage of, if you can really start to think about things in terms of releases and outcomes, and you can map them here in a horizontal release, then you get this kind of added roadmap experience as well, which is really nice. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good picture and helps you understand that, releases are far more than sprints. Sprints are just a delivery mechanism really for us to check in and make sure that, we're happy with how our delivery team and engineering team is working. Whereas releases, they've got so much more value to them. And I think people miss this a lot of the time. Right, let's move on to the next product area. Problem area. Stories. Over to you, Lewis.
Thanks, James. Yeah, whizzing through it. I think this will be a quick one as well because, hopefully it should be very apparent quite quickly what the problem is here. But this one is one that's relatively near and dear to my heart out of the Neo project management canon. Just look how kind of horrible this looks. You don't need to be writing full user story syntax for every story title. It's important to think about stories this way. That's how it came about, sure. But your titles need to be a short, succinct description of the work at hand, ideally from the customer's perspective, right? So when we write out the full syntax this way, it might help us educate our audience or the stakeholders that we're describing it to. But look how unclear this makes the map look. It makes it really difficult for us to have conversations about the work. Jeff Patton's actually probably got the best way of articulating this. And he says that if Amazon started every book with "as a reader," do you think you'd be able to find books easily? And it's really important that we can have or identify very quickly what the work is in order to have discussions about it. If we move down an example, James,
yep,
we hit to some degree the worst, but this is the last kind of mistake or problem area, and it should actually take us nicely into the wrap up, which is kind of how people are misusing or using story maps in general. But this is actually something that most teams don't even consider or would begin to ever recognize as a loss of opportunity. And it's that story mapping on sticky notes, as it's traditionally been done, does not give you enough context or enough information for you to effectively discuss, appraise, prioritize, or deliver the work at hand, right? Especially when it's beyond your immediate team. If you're in a workshop together and you workshopped on the board together with the whole team, there'll be some additional context from that session that you've all absorbed that make it feel like it's natural or possible or preferable to use story maps this way. But it's our belief and the belief of the customers we work with typically, right, that this doesn't work at any kind of scale. As soon as you're relying on that map being shared beyond your team, we're going to get a lot of misinterpretation, mismanagement of the maps, and an awful lot of manual process, right? And all of these things are going to ultimately slow innovation down, and that's the opposite of what we're trying to achieve in the map. So, James, I don't know if you want to kind of give a description of what it could look like, because I think this is a very new concept for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I guess we've got to sort of understand what is the balance that we're trying to strike here. We want a visualization of the stories that almost anyone could hop in and understand. If I looked at this and just looked at the title, search by location and where it is in the map, and if I work at Airbnb, I should be able to understand what we're working on there. So that's what we're trying to get from the initial visualization. But that's not enough for us to make prioritization decisions, for us to have discussions and get a story to a state where it's ready for developers and interrogate the whole experience. We actually need to put something behind that. And that's why, if you're working in a tool like Avion, you can actually basically bust open that story and add all this context that makes it, really, truly valuable, basically. So you can see this is where we've tracked our user story description. As a user, I want so that, our acceptance criteria. And you don't have to use that format. You can use whatever works for you, but this is the place to actually detail these things out. You can see you've got, the ability to add designs and attachments that like link up with Figma, for instance. You can start to add structure and consistency between your stories, which I think is really, really key, particularly for organizations at scale. You've got to have some consistency between stories. And you can use, for instance, we've got, tags and the ability to create tag categories, which we haven't done here. There's just one called tags, but you can start to, have your own little story API, if you like, for what do we need to be thinking about when we're writing these stories and prioritizing them. There's also, if I click into a blank story, you'll see that you can get consistency with your descriptions. So we've got these snippets that can apply to stories. So we could say every story must start with, as a I want so that, and then you could insert the acceptance criteria. You could obviously create that as one snippet if you wanted, or you can break them up into different sections. So it's just that added sort of functionality to be able to get the visualization you need, but also get all of the detail behind what you're actually doing, which starts to really bring story mapping to life, really brings the value to the fore. We've also got, obviously like comment threads, and this is, in our opinion, different from the comment thread that you might have in a tool like Jira, because by the time you're in Jira, you're thinking about delivery, you're thinking about engineering and technical challenges, and this is about planning. We're thinking about how is this going to affect our users, and maybe how could we do less with more, for instance. This is where we're having those conversations and discussions. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good rundown of what we think is the right balance to strike between getting something that's very visual that everyone can understand and see, and also adding that detail into those stories that you can do in Avion. So we've got one more problem area that we want to focus on, and this one is a little bit more holistic, really. And I think ultimately, what we've talked about so far, they're quite specific things, and you do need to get those things right, definitely. But I think if we were to bundle together, all of the conversations that we've had with people and seen how they've used story mapping, a lot of the time the issues fall into this, which is how they're actually approaching their story mapping practice. So, Lewis, if you want to kick us off with, what you've got on this.
Yeah, thanks, James. Do you want to start with integrations? Should we start there? So, for me, without a doubt, the biggest obstacle from people in this industry seeing 10x the value from their story mapping effort is the idea that story mapping is just a workshop exercise. And, something we do at the start of the project, it's something that gets everyone aligned. And then once we're done, all of our heads are turned, we go into delivery mode, that work gets copied up into Jira. Everybody does it. If you do it, I can sympathize, sure, but you're basically setting fire to all of that good product thinking, ideation that you and the team sunk during discovery, and when you put that initial map together. So, we see this as an enormous waste of time and resources, and in reality, you'll probably only receive maybe 1/10 of the gains you should be getting from story mapping or from discovery more broadly, even. And, having that completely disconnected planning and delivery process and, making delivery more difficult and losing all of that context and customer-centric thinking that we put in at the start is not a world or a reality that I think product people want to live in right now. And James, I think you can maybe talk a little bit more to what that might look like in the new world, and again, perhaps how we help enable with it. But again, I think this is something that's possible to do regardless of your platform or your tool of choice.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Lewis said, it seems mad that you'll put so much work into a story map, you'll get to a place where you've actually got a pretty good looking asset. And not only that, you've got agreement within your team. You've got everyone on the same page. We all understand what we're building and why and how it affects our customers. And then we start working in Jira, frantically typing up tickets. And 3 months down the line, what's a story map? We've completely forgotten about it. And we go back to our old ways of working. And then we come back around and we have to start again. So for us, it's about having separate processes between planning and delivery, but having them synced up. So that's basically what we have set up in Avion for you to do. And you get this really lovely setup where you've got planning, which is where you have these discussions about what you're going to build and why. And then you've got delivery, which is actually much easier to see what's going on when you don't have all of that other work just piled into Jira, which is all of the things that you may or may not ever do, which, by the way, we've even heard stories quite often of developers picking up that work. I mean, can you imagine how wasteful that is? You've got a developer picking up something that you never intended to work on. It's just, you throw, it's bad for everyone. It's bad for the developer, and it's bad for the product team, and it's bad for the business. So in Avion, when you've got to a stage where you've planned this release and it's ready, you can then basically just right click and push it to Jira. This is the stage where we're saying, this is now ready for delivery teams to work on it. Avion's going to pick up all the stories, push them all over to Jira, and then obviously you're going to end up with a bunch of issues in Jira. These things are now like in sync. They're two-way sync. So if I make a change to like sort listings, for instance, in Jira, just make a text change in there, you're going to see that update in real time in Avion, and obviously you can do it the other way around as well. It's not real time in Jira. I think you have to refresh, but it's still, the data's all in sync ultimately. So all the things that you can see basically sync up. So importantly, the title and the description, the status, which they're pretty much the most important things, but there's lots of other meta information that comes over from your planning in Avion, your designs, your attachments. You can see here that the epic, the release in Avion is synced to an epic in Jira. That's actually, you get the choice of how you want to set that up. There's various different configurations, and I won't kind of spend too much time going through that right now. But for us, this is what story mapping is about. It's about having that amazing planning environment drive your delivery consistently, not just a one-off exercise where everyone feels like they know exactly what's going on after the story mapping session, and then you just forget about it and you go back into Jira, and the bad habits just basically start from the day that you get back into Jira and you start doing everything in there again. So yeah, that's the sort of joined up process from Avion. I could obviously go into way more detail about this stuff, but I think for today's session, I think that's probably enough to explain, what your world could look like, whether you do this in Avion or not. There are other options for you to do this out there. Lewis, I don't know if you want to just briefly touch on like big, like messy maps, if you've got anything on that.
Yeah. I mean, just to carry on from what you put across there, James. Really, it's creating a planning environment that enables us to deliver more effectively, right? And there is a bit of a trend with the organisations I see who are kind of desperate for their story maps to become a mirror of what's in Jira, and just to have kind of all of the information in there all of the time. Eventually, especially if you've made any mistakes through the backbone releases and steps, you're going to get to a point where you've got even a story map that is now chaotic. It's a bit of a mess. It's disjointed and really hard to manage. And if you read the textbooks, right, there's an idea or a notion that you need to capture all of the experience in the story map. And whilst that's true, and it's great first principles thinking, the reality of large-scale software development or large-scale product delivery is that very quickly becomes unmanageable. And, before James kind of shows you how we might address that in Avion, I just want to give you some signals for when that might be happening. So the sense checks that you need to be making are, look at the map. Are we able to understand, appraise, prioritize stories quickly between different steps in the map? Have we got too many steps? Are they too far apart? Are we able to quickly understand, appraise, and prioritize stories within the same step? Is the map too deep? Are there too many things to even begin to have a discussion around what's most valuable? And are we able to treat the experience as a whole? It's all great capturing the experience as a whole, but do we find ourselves actually splitting up that experience, breaking it off, breaking it down, and tackling smaller areas? And I think if you're going through any of that in your process, I think, James, you could probably show some good workarounds or some good ways to address that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously, in Avion, you can have multiple story maps, and that's probably how we'd encourage you to think about things. But even if you get into a state where you've got one just like really valuable story map that's just quite big and quite hard to sort of wrangle, well, you can still use, for example, our filtering mechanism. So I could say, instead of showing me the entire backbone, just show me one journey. Or I could say, instead of showing me all the releases, just show me the booking experience release. Or you combine those two and you get, what was a massive story map has now been broken down into one journey and one release. So you can very, very quickly, kind of get to what you're actually working on. You could, for instance, as well, if I just restore this, you could switch the stories filter onto hide and then say, only show me stories that have a tag of engagement. Switch off, move this side panel, and then you've got a story map that is, filtered through the lens of engagement. And that could be a story that you need to tell to your stakeholder. So you can kind of use these filters both for wrangling big maps and actually, really breaking down what you actually need to work on and focus on, but also to communicate certain things with certain stakeholders. So that's how we see a lot of our customers using these filters to really get even more sort of value out of story maps. Okay, cool. So I think that's pretty much all we've got for today. I think even more detail, we could go into some of these things. We've decided that we're going to do a separate questions session. So if you do have questions, we're going to do a Q&A roundtable as a follow-up session. So if you are interested in joining this, please follow the link in the comments on LinkedIn, or follow the link above or below this video once we've uploaded it. If you want to actually just speak to us directly, then please obviously just private message us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great rest of the day, and we hope to see you soon. Cheers.